All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Gavin Bannerman, and I've got the honour of being very grand title of the Director of Queensland Memory at the State Library of Queensland. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. This location of State Library on Quilpa Point was historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people. It's a tradition that we continue proudly on occasions such as these. I'm really looking forward tonight. I think it's a real privilege to be able to come to events such as these and see the fruits of all of our fellows' labour. I know that they've been, into the collection in a really deep way, and I think the journey of a fellow is something which you almost need to talk publicly to an audience such as this to realise the significance of what you've done. There's a cycle to these kind of fellowships, and as one fellowship is coming towards its conclusion, sadly, a new door is opening for new fellowship applications. I would just like to remind everyone, obviously, that applications are now open for the Q ANZAC 100 fellowship program, as well as our other Queensland Memory fellowship categories. I encourage you to look at the State Library homepage for all of that information. And just that applications are due the 21st of March. So you've got a little bit of time yet, but not too much time. So yeah, 21st of March, and there's information on our website for anyone who has any other questions. Also, please ask as many questions as you can tonight. This is really your chance. There are no dumb questions. So to conduct this evening's proceedings, I'd like to welcome Ian Townsend, himself a previous fellow, John Oxley Library Fellow at the State Library of Queensland, to conduct the events tonight. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Gavin. Yes, my name's Ian Townsend, and I've been a fellow here. As Gavin said, a John Oxley Library Fellow. At the moment, I'm doing a research PhD in history at the University of Queensland, looking at the Pearling Fleet disaster, which was the subject of my John Oxley Library Fellowship back in 2008. And that led to a book that I wrote about the disaster, and that led to this PhD. So I guess that sort of shows you that these fellowships really provide all sorts of opportunities for researchers, and their value really can't be understated. There's so much that can come from this sort of research, and there's so many interesting things to discover, as we all know. So we'll be hearing today 3 presentations from the current State Library Q ANZAC 100 Fellows. The 2017 Fellows were announced at the Queensland Memory Awards ceremony last June. Artist Greer Townshend, North Stradbroke Island Museum Administrator Lisa Jackson, historian Dr. Judith Powell, and Peter Crossman. Now, Peter's couldn't make it today because he's been working though on Queensland memorial rolls of the Great War, and his project's really interesting. It's sort of re-honouring the men and women named on all the Queensland War memorial rolls of honour, and he's been finding all sorts of different roles and stories behind them, and the mystery of some of the people who are there and they can't be found, and also the roles of women in the First World War. So his project's sort of encouraging as well the custodians of the rolls to have a standard database. You see these rolls and the names are there, but there's not much information about the people. So Peter's working on a sort of template to go behind those roles, which is really important, I think. And if you'd like to read a bit more about Peter's work, you have to have a look at the State Library blog. But today we'll hear the 3 other projects that actually span aspects of both world wars. In fact, the fellowships are for projects that uncover and explore untold stories about Queensland's experience during the First World War or other significant military campaigns from the last 100 years. And in fact, there's an argument, isn't there, that the Second World War was just an extension of the First. After we hear from the fellows, there'll be plenty of time to ask questions, and we'll have microphones. So if you do have a think about what sort of questions you might like to ask, and wait until a microphone reaches you before speaking, because this event's being recorded and will be available, I think, online for all posterity. So it's helpful for archivists and librarians of the future, you know, to have good quality material to start with, really, in their research, and this will form part of that. Now, our first fellow is Greer Townshend, no relation to me. Greer was born in New Zealand and she's based in Brisbane. She's a multidisciplinary artist and has lived and worked in Japan and France as well. Greer is interested in the subconscious of expression in art and explores the concept of fragility when it comes to expressions of memory, language, or the self. So it's a really interesting project looking at images and artwork produced and described by soldiers. So it goes, I guess, sort of beyond what soldiers can say when they come back. And often, I suppose, that helps explain some of the trauma that they've been through and how they've tried to cope with it. Greer has a Bachelor in Fine Arts and is completing a Bachelor of Arts in Art History, for which she received the Scholarship for Academic Excellence. She's been a finalist in multiple drawing awards, both nationally and internationally. She's also recently been shortlisted for a $150,000 triple sculpture commission for the Bulcock Street development in Caloundra. Her most recent solo show at the Noosa Regional Gallery explored archetypal imagery and the secrets of the heart. And so her Q ANZAC 100 project, Treasure a Soldier's Story, is searching for those sorts of images in the letters, diaries and possessions of Queensland soldiers during the First World War. Here's Greer Townshend.
Hello. So firstly, I would like to thank the State Library of Queensland and the Queensland Museum. This fellowship has been an incredible experience. I would also like to thank in particular the soldiers I'll be discussing this evening for their courage, heart, and even humour, as well as for the insight and eloquence in their writings. I wish that I could have met you. I would also like to thank the families of the soldiers for your foresight in keeping and caring for these collections, and for your generosity in sharing such an intimate and treasured part of your family's story. So tonight I will be speaking about the power of imagery. And to explore this, I would like us to explore this forest together using your imagination. You have been collecting images and ideas of what a forest is your whole life, and according to some, even before that. So I would like you to draw on your bank of images now for this exercise. So I'd like everybody to please close your eyes and picture a forest. Imagine a lush green forest before you. Picture yourself now walking towards the shadowed path. You breathe in the fresh scent of the trees and feel the soft dirt beneath your feet. You are walking through this beautiful forest with your older sibling or someone you feel close to and protected by. You admire the dappled sunlight that patterns the path before you, and the gentle sound of the wind moving through the trees makes you feel calm and happy. Keeping your eyes closed, I would like you now to imagine you are 5 years old, sitting cross-legged on the classroom floor, listening to your teacher as she reads you Hansel and Gretel. She holds up the book so you can see picture after picture of the magical and ominous-looking forest. She reads, "The children walked the entire night, but they did not find their way out of the woods. The third morning they started walking again, but only managed to go deeper and deeper into the woods. If help did not come soon, they would perish." Keeping your eyes closed, I would like you to return to the image of you walking through the forest. You are reaching the outer edge now. It's getting lighter, and you can see your farm in the distance. Home, you think to yourself. Now please open your eyes. This is what you see before you now. It is Monday the 27th of November 1916, winter in France. You are 21 years old. You are a stretcher bearer, one of the most dangerous non-combatant positions to hold. You arrived at this location with your unit that morning, and you stay here for almost a month. That evening, you open your tiny diary, barely bigger than a matchbox, and in purple-coloured pencil you write, Delville Wood, where the fierce battle was fought some time previous, has been a death trap for both the enemy and ourselves. Bodies lay there unburied in great numbers. It is a horrible sight. The wood itself is nothing but a mass of charred, broken timber. It is one of the longest entries in your diary over the last 10 months. You have scribbled your description down, yet perhaps unconsciously it seems you make the following words most legible. Delville Wood, death trap, bodies. You even write bodies with a capital B. And so I wonder, what does the image of a forest mean to you, Herbert Malyon, the owner of this diary? Delville Wood was quickly, and understandably so, nicknamed Devil's Wood by the soldiers. The battle was a series of engagements in the infamous Battle of the Somme, commencing in July 1916, 4 months before Herbert even arrived there. To situate Herbert's diary entry, I searched for other soldiers' accounts of Devil's Wood. I read entries by a British and a German soldier, both of whom went into great detail about the mud and the blood, how bodies lay swollen, 4 deep in the trenches, and how horrific the scene was when the light hit the faces of the dead. Yet Herbert chooses to describe the condition of the woods, not the bodies. Broken, he writes, nothing but a mass of charred, broken wood. It leads me to the question, if we have the opportunity to capture something of our experiences, particularly in extreme circumstances, with limited resources, limited time, limited energy, what do we choose to describe? From the innumerable images that bombard us, how do we choose to describe it, and why? Herbert was being exposed to atrocities almost daily and would have witnessed horrific casualties with regularity. However, I noticed over the first 14 months of Herbert's diaries, each time there is a longer entry, he is lamenting the destruction of the trees. The philosopher Thomas Carlyle wrote, "It is in and through symbols that man, consciously or unconsciously, lives, works, and has his being." In my research project, I am searching for archetypal imagery in the letters, diaries, photographs, and possessions of Queensland soldiers during the First World War. I'm interested in the idea that through simply distilling imagery from the collections, we might gain a new understanding of what the soldiers were feeling, so that we can connect with their experiences in a different way. This is a sample of some of the images I have pulled from the collection so far. They have been referenced to in the soldiers' day-to-day environment, whether on the battlefield in France and Turkey, in training in Egypt, or on furlough in the UK. The research is helping me to build up a visual language so that I can then translate, as best I can, the soldiers' stories into a series of drawings which explore the personal and collective unconscious during wartime. So what is an archetypal image, and how might both our personal and ancestral past play a part in how we view images? The Webster Dictionary defines an archetype as the original pattern on which all things of the same type are representations or copies. In Jungian theory, it is described as a universal symbol which transcends time and culture and evokes profound, often unconscious responses in a person. These symbols make up what Jung refers to as the collective unconscious, a kind of database of imagery which he believed we inherit from our ancestors. For this project, I am exploring both the personal and the collective unconscious. I'm interested in a soldier's individual background and his identity as a Queenslander, and I'm also interested in his human experience of processing imagery. Therefore, using these concepts as a departure point for my research, ostensibly simplistic images described in the letters and diaries, such as forest, flower, house, or boat, when within the environment of a soldier in a war zone, could reveal a greater story. Forest could conjure up feelings of magic, mystery, fear, the concept of nourishment, or the archetype of the hero's journey, as Hansel and Gretel are going on here. Such imagery can be further explored through research of the possessions soldiers brought with them from home or acquired while abroad. These images are part of Queensland Museum's First World War collection, which I was lucky enough to view firsthand. Given financial limitations and that few items were available or portable, I think about the possible reverence the soldiers had for the chosen objects and how that could speak to an ancestral desire for physical and emotional survival. Belongings such as these souvenirs, picked up from markets while training in Egypt, can become a type of treasure imbued with sacredness. I wonder, did the soldiers merely consider these objects keepsakes for loved ones back home? Did the market vendors perhaps explain to the soldiers the meaning behind them? Is it possible that subconsciously the soldiers had an understanding of the powerful symbols they were carrying in their backpacks? At the top is a scarab beetle, a good luck charm, and at the bottom is Anubis, the god of death. Amy Romberg, editor-in-chief of the Book of Symbols, in her discussion In Search of the Missing Symbols, offers a beautiful definition of an archetype symbol. Most of the time, we never notice the sky as we live our busy lives. But one night, we may look up into the sky and see the stars. And when that happens, we are flooded with emotions. And that is when an image turns into an archetypal image. Flooded with emotion is a very apt phrase with which to discuss my research methodology for this project also. The State Library's World War I collection is both substantial and overwhelming. Given that my aim is to create artworks which evoke an emotive response in the viewer, after initially selecting soldiers' collections at random, I simply chose those with whom I felt the greatest connection to focus on. Finishing some letters, I had goosebumps on my arms. Finishing some diaries, I had a physical pain in my chest. Herbert's diary was one of them. I made a conscious effort to read as little about the soldier as possible previous to reading his letters and diaries, as I wanted to discover what my organic responses would be and what I could learn about a person from such a narrow window into their life. I didn't know their age, their hometown, or even if they made it home from war. I simply opened the box and began. As I read and reread the letters, I noted in my workbook any imagery I found interesting, places or battles I hadn't heard of, any topics that were repeated, and so on, looking for connections, looking for story. Once I had a list of imagery, I looked up the commentaries described in the Book of Symbols. It's an incredible resource of over 800 images, with accompanying essays discussing the cultural and psychological placement of symbols across time. The book is only the tip of the iceberg. If you go to their website, aras.org, you'll find over 18,000 images, along with timelines denoting when, where, and how the image has been utilized and looked to in the past. Here, forest is described, detailing that the forest itself is a symbol of the unconscious. It represents the endless and the eternal. It represents boundaries. The essayist reminds us that before walking upright, our ancestors used to live in trees. The forest was home. So back to Herbert. At this stage, I wanted to know where home was for Herb. I was intrigued to learn that he was from Springsure, a rural town in Queensland, overlooked by lush green mountain ranges. I learnt that he was a station hand, working on a farm each day, and that he had an older brother. I also learnt that Herbert didn't come home. I continued trying to build a sort of imagery carousel of Herbert's experience with which to base my artwork on. If I couldn't find images of places Herbert referenced in the State Library collection, I also looked at the Australian War Memorial Catalogue in books and online. On March 4th, 1917, Herbert wrote, "Had a look through the village of Fleur. Nothing of village left except a heap of ruins. The village is situated on high ground, surrounded by wood. The trees are torn up with shell fire, branches scattered about, intermingled with bricks, timber of houses, etc. Altogether a sight of utter destruction." Further imagery for Herbert. A fortnight before his death, Herbert finally received 10 days leave for London. He had been wishing for it for many months. He had a very full visit, and it was an absolute bombardment of new imagery for not only a station hand from Springsure, but also for someone freshly off battlefields. Herbert went everywhere, to the V&A, the National Gallery. He saw the changing of the guards, and several musicals in the evenings, one of which was Chu Chin Chow, which featured over a dozen scene changes and exotic costumes. The show was apparently very popular with the troops because of the scantily clad ladies. This image was published in Tatler only 3 days after Herbert visited the show. Herbert also visited London Zoo. Animals can have strong symbolic meaning, so I wondered which animals he saw and what imagery he might have retained. Side note, he may have seen the bear, down the bottom, that went on to inspire Christopher Robin's Winnie the Pooh. In terms of aesthetics and physicality, I find the diaries very moving. They are fragile, the colours are muted, they are beautiful. They often remind me of Cy Twombly paintings, which is his painting down the bottom. Here, Herbert writes, "Went into trenches on Somme front. We carried our wounded about 4 miles by hand over shells, raining every day and night, feet always wet and clothes much the same. We are in a sorry pickle, mud from head to foot, but still happy." It looks as if when he read over his entry the next day, he went back to add, "but still happy." I wondered if he wrote that to reassure himself, or if he simply felt happy with his friends that day, or if he thought of his mother reading his diary if he wasn't to make it back. This is the smaller diary up the top from which I've been reading. It is tiny and missing its cover, adding to its vulnerability. Herbert's second and larger diary is the deep red colour of the heart. Here I'm particularly interested in the way he has written his name down the edges of the pages, as if a metaphor for our many layers, or how our many experiences form a whole. I'd like to briefly touch on a couple of other soldiers I'll be focusing on. Michael Levine, a young shearer from Toowoomba. There is one 4-page letter in the collection and one photograph. The letter details Michael's experience landing at Gallipoli. He died 3 days after writing the letter. We landed under heavy shell fire from the enemy. We had about a mile to go in open boats from the transport to the beach. One man got wounded while in my company as we were landing, although the shrapnel was bursting overhead and bullets were splashing around in the water all around us. I discovered that the ocean, like the forest, is a symbol of the limitless psyche. Boats are connectors, a symbol of the feminine, and can conjure up images of being rocked in your mother's arms. Maurice Del Prat was a prisoner of war in Turkey. It is an enormous collection of over 200 letters. He writes beautifully, to the point of persuading me at the beginning that being a prisoner wasn't so bad. He makes mention of the flowers, and in particular poppies. He writes, "We are having a very hot spell, but the whole place is a perfect flower garden after the heavy June rains. Many of the flowers are new to me, but I know the poppies and daisies with about 4 or 5 other varieties. They grow thickly, almost as those cultivated in beds and everywhere." Although we now see the poppy as a symbolic image of war, Nicholas Saunders, in his book The Poppy, writes that in 1935, fossilized poppy capsules, later carbon dated to around 4000 BCE, were discovered in the cave of Bats in southern Spain. The capsules, along with locks of hair, were tucked inside woven grass baskets, which were laid alongside human skeletons, the earliest evidence to date of poppies being placed at a grave. So again, I wonder, at a primal level, what does the image of a poppy really mean to us? I also came across a lot of beautiful flower imagery in the embroidered postcards in the collection. I was really interested in this aesthetically, and also in seeing weaving or embroidery as a delicate and intricate way of connecting stories. So I contacted the Queensland Embroiderers Guild and did a course on silk ribbon embroidery, as I would like to work this medium into my drawings on paper eventually. In terms of my own work, I usually work in some way around a charcoal portrait. This is a portrait of my friend Adam. And so I've been thinking for some time about what kind of work I wanted to make from the research and the ways in which I can combine mediums to best express what I've learnt so far. This is a work from my show at Noosa Regional Gallery last year. I made sculptural paper works. They were large origami hearts combined with paper cutting and drawing on the inside. You can peer into the middle of the heart. This is the same work unfolded. So again, I'm interested in what is going on inside our hearts when we process experience and the different ways that that can be described through art. From a distance, it looks like a butterfly, but up close, the body of the butterfly is in fact two figures embracing in a swirl of flowers. More recently, I've been playing with the idea of incorporating light and silhouettes and shadow play into the works. I was also looking at how it would feel to receive some of the letters that the soldiers were sending home. So that was a little soldier popping out of the letter. And so when thinking about the models I wanted to use for my Anzac project, something that kept coming to mind was the grace and strength with which all the diaries and letters were written. So I approached Queensland Ballet with the hope that the dancers would pose for me for some of the silhouettes, and to my great joy they said yes. So I took several extracts from the letters and diaries and added questions for the dancers to read and to get them thinking about what kind of poses might portray the emotions that the soldiers were feeling. So over the last few weeks I've been working with the dancers to create poses for my future body of work, and I'm now starting to work on the preliminary drawings. I've added in a couple of slides of the dancers because they're so amazing and I couldn't resist. So they came up with lots of these on their own. It was a really fun experience working with them. So what I have decided on is to create 5 large paper-cut light box artworks based on the collections of 5 soldiers. The layered paper-cut designs will be placed in the centre of a charcoal portrait. It will be a 3D work, so that it is as if you were looking inside the chest of the soldier and seeing more and more layers going back through the drawing. So it would be moving from the personal unconscious at the front and looking through the drawing and all of the layers, you would see the collective unconscious at the back, and it would be lit from the back as well. It's a little bit tricky to describe because it doesn't exist yet. So here I am just starting to make the patterns for the layers of the drawings. So those 4 would eventually sit on top of each other to form the layers. I know that I will never be able to fully understand or capture how the soldiers were feeling, but I hope that I can create works that hint at the emotion, works that share these incredible stories, and works that create memories for a new generation. I want to make sure that, in particular, the soldiers who didn't get to come home will be remembered, and that through imagery they will find a way home in our hearts and minds. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greer. That's fascinating. An aspect I actually hadn't have thought of before, but trying to recreate what the soldiers saw. And that's really getting at the heart of what they might have experienced. Thanks very much. Now, our next fellow is Lisa Jackson, and Lisa's the administrator of the North Stradbroke Island Historical Museum. Fascinating range of history at Straddy, and I had some help from the museum a long time ago when I was writing a book about plague in Queensland, and in fact the opening scene of my fictional novel, which I researched over at Straddy a bit, was set in 1921 at the Inebriate Institution at Dunwich. So the Benevolent Asylum, which sort of incorporates that, and it's changed its role over the years, has a colourful and also sad history, but Lisa's producing some insights into alcoholism amongst returned soldiers at what was then the Inebriate Institution at Dunwich. Her project's been looking at what help was given to these men, and also how the government and society treated them, how they were cared for as returned soldiers who became alcoholics. Her Q ANZAC 100 fellowship is entitled The Unfinished War, the Post-War Lives of Returned Soldiers Who Spent Time in the Inebriate Institution at Dunwich. Lisa Jackson.
I'll just start with some thank yous as well, as Greer did. First of all, I'd like to thank the State Library staff. The fellowship is just the most extraordinary experience, and I'm just so grateful for the opportunity and for the help from the staff. Also the staff at the State Archives and the National Archives, because this project needed stuff to be brought together from all over the place. Also my colleagues at the North Stradbroke Island Museum on Winjerribah, we've just changed our name, especially to the President, Jeff Moore, who's here this evening, and also to Howard Gill, the Secretary there, who offered a lot of feedback on my drafts and ideas and helped me with the graphs, which we'll see soon. There's also a fellow called John Winterbotham who has spent a lot of time, many years, trying to identify various World War I soldiers and where they're buried, and he's done an amazing lot of work that helped my research. And I'd also like to acknowledge my family, who are long suffering, and thank you. Okay. The Dunwich Benevolent Asylum was established by the government of the new colony of Queensland on North Stradbroke Island in 1865. Its purpose was to house and care for people who were unable to provide for themselves, the poor and destitute, the disabled, diseased, the old and infirm, and in some cases, those with untreated mental illness. It was a major institution with over 1,100 inmates at the turn of the century. It serviced the whole of Queensland. Within the asylum was established, the Inebriate Institution was established to manage alcoholics. Inebriates, habitually found drunk on the streets of Brisbane and country towns, could be sentenced by a magistrate to serve a period of time in Dunwich, to be treated for their condition. Separately, people could refer themselves to the institution voluntarily. For a few years, the Inebriate Institution operated on Peel Island, but it was moved back to Dunwich just as the men started to return from World War I. Over 450 men who returned from fighting overseas spent time at Dunwich. At least 220 of those were admitted as inebriates. So the focus of the research that I've done for my Q ANZAC 100 fellowship has been to find out more about these men who were admitted to the Dunwich Inebriate Institution and the reasons for them to be institutionalised. What was it about their particular circumstances that brought them to Dunwich? In particular, was it because of their particular personal characteristics and character, or because of the structural and economic and social factors? So, who were these men? Harold Griffiths enlisted in November 1914, aged 30. He served in Egypt, Gallipoli and France, and returned to Australia in 1918. His repat file documents that at Gallipoli he got decidedly more nervous and finally could do nothing. This is a case of severe chronic neurasthenia. By April 1919, he is serving a 3-month stint in the Inebriate Institution. In February 1920, he applied to the repat to return to the UK. This man applied for free passage to England, where his mother resides, and is prepared and capable of assisting him. He states his war disability prevents him from continuing long in employment. He has no friends and no relatives in Australia and finds it difficult to exist on his pension of 7 and 6 per week and is compelled at times to sleep in a park. His request is denied because he doesn't appear to be totally incapacitated. By 1924, the records say he seems unable to resist alcohol for very long at a time, and his nervous disability is apparently very largely due to this. Is much the same as on his return from the front, is miserable and wretched, cannot work, though he wants to, has a dragging feeling in his heart and can only feel frightened. He suffers from night terrors, which they treat with bromide. He serves 2 more terms in Dunwich and then at the Broadwater Convalescent Farm, where, in view of his alcoholic record and in spite of warnings, it is now considered by the departmental medical officer that further treatment is inadvisable. He is therefore discharged as of today, and should he report to the farm, he must be refused admittance. Harold dies in September 1927 in Rockhampton of an inflamed gallbladder. He was aged 40 and he had no relatives and he was destitute. So there's many, many stories like Harold, and that's what I've spent the last year researching. Overwhelmingly, the task of caring for tens of thousands of returning men was done inside families, primarily by mothers, wives, sisters and daughters. So for soldiers like Harold, who didn't return home to the safety, warmth and privacy of family, life was difficult. Soldiers like Harold, just one example of the hundreds who spent time in Dunwich, were forced to live life in public as itinerant workers, moving between various Red Cross and Salvation Army hostels, in government institutions and on the streets, without nurture, comfort and security. It's always dangerous to generalise, and across the 220 returned soldiers admitted to the Inebriate Institution, there is of course the whole range of experiences. But in broad terms, the key factors to successfully reintegrating into post-war life were a family and a job. The returned soldiers who spent time in the Dunwich Inebriate Institution could broadly be described as older, unmarried and unemployed. I have found in this research that the reason for their admittance to the Inebriate Institution was due to a combination of factors, but their marital status, advanced age and economic circumstances set them apart from the thousands of other returned soldiers who never set foot in the Benevolent Asylum. It can be argued that their consumption of alcohol was much less a factor than their lack of family support and their employment status. So, some statistics to support this idea. 66% of the Dunwich Inebriate returned soldiers were over the age of 30 when they enlisted. Less than 10% were young men under 25. A significant number lied about their age to enlist because they were over the cut-off age of 45. 45. A surprising number had been to the Boer War. According to the 1921 census, around 30% of men in the total population over 25 were single. However, around 85% of the soldiers admitted to the Inebriate Institution were single. A substantial number cited their next of kin on their enlistment papers as their parents or their siblings who lived elsewhere in Britain. These were men with little or no extended family in Queensland. Before the war, these men worked in a range of occupations, from labourers, mechanics and miners to engine drivers and accountants. After the war, unemployment was around 11% and up to 25% in the agricultural, pastoral and mining industries where most of these fellas worked before the war. Unemployment rose to over 30% by the late 1920s, so work was very difficult to find. Many returned soldiers were itinerant, travelling around the countryside looking for whatever work they could find. Invariably, the men in Dunwich were broke. The 1921 census also tells us that single men older than 30 were twice as likely to be unemployed than their married counterparts. Returned servicemen were eligible for pensions, which were administered by the newly formed Repatriation Commission. The Repat, as it was known, had branches in every state and a network of local committees to look after the veterans in their area. Its most basic function was to support returned soldiers back into civilian life and provide sustenance until employment was available. The Repat also administered medical services, requiring the soldiers to report for a 6-monthly check to make sure their eligibility for their pensions was still current. These inebriate soldiers had a harder time than others in maintaining their service pensions. The Repat refused to accept alcoholism as a war-related condition. Ex-soldiers who fronted up for a medical check showing any evidence of drinking had their pensions cut or completely cancelled. Even a military medal and the loss of an arm didn't secure a pension for life, as in the case of Albert Lambert, who I don't have a photo of, despite looking for months. At 5'3", Albert Lambert was initially refused entry to the army for being under height, but eventually was able to enlist and he went off to serve in France. He was awarded the military medal for repeatedly returning to no man's land to rescue wounded men under heavy fire. The citation praised his splendid example of bravery and coolness under fire. Later in the war, his arm was amputated below the elbow after a mortar shell shattered the bone, and he returned to Australia with a pension of £1.1 per week for 6 months. The repat refused him treatment soon after returning home because of his alcoholism. His file notes admits alcohol, but says his stump has been painful and irritating, and this has driven him to drink. He worked at a mental hospital in Melbourne as a messenger. By 1921, he's working in Murwillumbah as a banana chipper. He writes to the repat, "The arm does not chafe at all, and I use it for everything." His last correspondence with the repat is in 1923 and has him saying, "I will be able to carry on by myself. Thank you." He is admitted to the Inebriate Institution at least 4 times throughout the 1920s and into the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum another 4 times until he dies in 1944, aged 63, with no money and no property. He's buried in the Dunwich Cemetery in an unmarked grave. There were 2 ways to be admitted to the to the Inebriate Institution. In this immediate post-war period, men and women were able to check themselves in and could be admitted as a kind of rehabilitation. There is evidence that the repat actively encouraged soldiers to self-admit to Dunwich as a way of getting them off their books. Others, and this is quite a few of the soldiers, were sentenced to the institution, usually for a 3-month term, but sometimes longer, by a magistrate. Soldiers brought before a magistrate may have been picked up by the police for being drunk, or sometimes they would have actually committed a crime and were faced with the option of going to jail or going to Dunwich. Some preferred jail. Dunwich was portrayed by the authorities as a place where returned servicemen would be offered appropriate treatment for their alcoholism. For those suffering from shell shock or war-caused injuries affecting their employment prospects, the island environment offered sea air, a space for quietness and contemplation, companionship, rest and good food. In the case of one ex-soldier, Joseph Slack, a concerned friend wrote on his behalf to the repat, "The medical officer advised him to go to the Home for Soldiers in Dunwich, where there were nurses and doctors and plenty of fishing, etc., and 3 months' holiday there would set him up again." Another ex-soldier, John Kelly, told his doctor he was trying to get into the Dunwich Benevolent Home, where he hoped he'd be able to pull himself together. However, the realities of life in Dunwich for the soldier inmates was quite basic. The men were housed in large dormitory-style rooms and took their meals in a communal mess hall. There were always complaints about the quality of food, the tobacco and the tea. When beds in the soldiers' wards were filled, men were accommodated in these top tents, a row of individual, semi-permanent shelters where inmates could enjoy a bit of privacy and perhaps grow a few vegetables and cook for themselves over an open fire. Even then it didn't suit everybody, with one soldier telling the repat that the last week he spent at Dunwich was the worst week of his life. From as early as 1918, there was considerable public debate about the treatment of the returned servicemen in Dunwich, with concerns raised about the quality of the medical care, the standard of accommodation and the food. Joseph Slack's friend's letter went on to say, "How very depressing it is for these brave returned heroes, suffering from shell shock, etc., to see the open graves, the funerals, the miserable wreck of humanity. Surely with all their faults, those who have so nobly fought for us deserve better treatment than this." An inquiry conducted by the Returned Sailors and Soldiers Imperial League of Australia in 1918 found that the Inebriate Institution was not a suitable place for the returned servicemen, most of whom had entered voluntarily. It is alleged that it was represented to them that, this is what the report says, sorry. It is alleged that it was represented to them that they would be able to, that they were being sent to a place where the food and facilities of sport and recreation would enable them to repair damage which has been done to their nervous system by the strain of active service. These men do not seem inebriates in the ordinary sense of the term, but it is to be remembered that the shell shock and the experiences of men who have undergone a long spell of fighting brings their nervous system into such a state that a slight indulgence in alcohol or any undue excitement or strain affects them immediately. This inquiry was reported very widely in the popular press and led to a range of specific changes, including the introduction of Ward 9.5, which was dedicated to soldiers, so they could be seen to be living separately from the ordinary inmates. The soldiers were no longer required to work inside the asylum, and the rations provided for them were slightly improved and more plentiful. Unfortunately for the soldiers, the medical superintendent at the time, Dr. James Booth Clarkson, didn't approve of these privileges. Booth Clarkson had had a long military career, including service in the Spanish-American War and the Boer War. He was of the opinion that alcoholism indicated a weakness of character and thought the best treatment was sedation for a few days and then a regime of abstinence and hard work. He resented what he saw as the special treatment for the soldiers. He wrote in his annual report, "In many cases, there are readmissions, which is not to be wondered at when the surroundings are so comfortable and pleasant. I am now not recommending any extension of time in the institution, except occasionally for those who have undertaken work." To discourage these soldier loafers from enjoying the luxuries of Dunwich, he advocated to the repat that if a soldier was admitted to the Inebriate Institution more than twice, he should only be further committed to the Benevolent Asylum as an ordinary inmate, where there was expectations of work, fewer rations and a lower standard of accommodation. And despite his reports indicating that the institution was a fairly dry community, inmates who performed any kind of work within the asylum were rewarded with daily shots of rum, which then could be traded amongst the non-working inmates. There is also evidence that there was an active and lucrative sly grog trade involving visitors, staff and inmates. The Smiths Weekly reported, "Dunwich is supposed to be dry. No grog allowed other than what can be ordered by the doctor, or when on special occasions a tot of rum or a half pint of ale is doled out to all hands. It is not unusual, however, for inmates who have been placed on a grog allowance by medical orders to save up their issue and sell it to others, especially to those in the 9.5 ward." 4 returned soldiers and an Aboriginal worker in the asylum named Tom Tate were actually banished from the island when their role in trading alcohol became apparent. It appears Tom Tate took a boat over to Cleveland on Christmas Eve, 1921, with orders from a whole range of inebriate inmates. 4 soldiers subsequently had quite a raucous party with the assistance of a bottle of whiskey, 3 bottles of rum and a dozen bottles of beer. This resulted in an all-night drunken brawl where a soldier's face was wounded with a heavy piece of iron piping, a wardsman suffered a broken nose, and at least one soldier was found near the visitors' quarters, frightening some young females who were visiting for Christmas. Despite repeated recommendations that a dedicated soldiers' facility be established, it never eventuated. By 1924, there was practically little difference in the treatment of ordinary inmates and the inebriates at Dunwich. The asylum admitted many inmates multiple times over decades. When they weren't in Dunwich, hundreds of returned servicemen spent years travelling around Queensland looking for work, moving between hostels set up by organisations such as the Red Cross and the YMCA to provide medical care, housing and support. The YMCA had facilities in the city, including this hut on North Quay near the Victoria Bridge. They were focused on providing recreation and a social outlet for the returned men and short-term accommodation for visiting families, for families visiting their soldiers in hospital. They provided over 200,000 meals per year in that post-war period. And the Red Cross established a whole network of soldiers' rest homes to provide care for wounded and incapacitated soldiers. The matrons in charge of these homes had little or no tolerance for drinking, and soldiers could be banned if they arrived drunk or misbehaved. This is a whole series of photos of these different rest homes around Brisbane, further afield. These precious photos were found in the personal papers of Zena Cumbrae Stewart, who was one of the stalwarts of the Red Cross, who raised money to buy these bikes and various equipment for the soldiers. There is no doubt that many returned soldiers in the Inebriate Institution were alcoholics. However, a soldier's admittance to the Inebriate Institution shouldn't define them. Many were what we would today call binge drinkers, sporadically consuming large amounts of alcohol, and contemporary newspapers reported on the subsequent brawls, broken shop windows and car accidents that resulted. And after a 3-month stint in the Inebriate Institution, most of them just went back to their lives. The long-term mental trauma of the returned soldiers cannot be extrapolated from the admission figures to the Dunwich Inebriate Institution. The effects of trauma, shell shock, of gas, of TB, VD, and of wounds that continue to hurt for years aren't in the records. For some, their families hold their stories. But for those on the margins, without family, and who couldn't conform to the repatriation's requirements of keeping an address and a steady job, their presence in the Inebriate Institution is a reminder of our poor understanding of the lingering effects of war trauma, and also how the social conditions of family and class had a major impact on the post-war lives of the returned soldiers in Queensland. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. That was quite harrowing, really, wasn't it? Imagine a returned soldier describing a week at Dunwich as the worst week of his life. That's saying something. Poor blokes. And they didn't really understand alcohol, did they, back then, and causes and effects and treatments. Now, here's something else to imagine. A million US servicemen, speaking of alcohol, passing through Brisbane during World War II. And I'm guessing that the combination of young men, again, you know, many still in adolescence, if you believe that adolescence lasts until you're about 24, which I think is probably conservative for a lot of men. And so many young men being away from home for the first time, alcohol and the social upheaval of war itself. So it makes you wonder what was reflected in the crime statistics in Brisbane at the time. And Dr. Judith Powell, who's a Brisbane-based historian and archaeologist, has been looking at this phenomenon in her Q ANZAC 100 project, Crime, Passion and Opportunity Policing Brisbane during World War II. Dr. Judith Powell.
Thank you. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese First Air Fleet attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, thereby bringing America into the Second World War. The cruiser, the USS Pensacola, bound for the Philippines, had left Pearl Harbor only a week before the Japanese attack and was now diverted to Australia. The convoy entered Moreton Bay on the 22nd of December and the cruiser tied up at Newstead Wharf. Today, it's difficult to appreciate how critical the years 1941 and 42 were for Australia. War in Europe had cost the country dear. Over 800 men from the 9th Division died during the siege of Tobruk in October 41, with another 900 taken prisoner. In the Greek campaign, 320 men of the 6th Division were killed and over 2,000 captured. When Singapore fell to the Japanese in February 42, almost 15,000 Australian troops were taken prisoner. Midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour and Darwin and Townsville were bombed. In March 1942, General Douglas MacArthur, recalled to duty by President Roosevelt and appointed Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific, escaped from Corregidor Island in the Philippines and made his way to Australia, where he set up initially in Melbourne before arriving in Brisbane to establish headquarters at the AMP building in July, and that's now the MacArthur Museum, of course. He, his wife, young son and their Chinese ama lived, as did many officers, in Lennon's Hotel. No one can accurately say how many troops passed through Brisbane. Dutch, British, Filipino, Australian troops from interstate, but above all, American, including, despite Prime Minister Curtin's reluctance, up to 100,000 African Americans. Estimates run as high as 1 million. Certainly by June 1943, 67% of all American forces in Australia were stationed in Queensland, and the population of Brisbane doubled. Soon American forces had requisitioned, whoops, that's out of order for some reason, but anyway, doesn't matter, I guess. Soon American forces had requisitioned buildings across the city, racecourses became tent cities, schools closed, and when they remained open, children dug slit trenches in case of invasion. Water pipes to combat fires in the event of bombing ran down Brisbane's main streets. Blackout regulations were enforced, car headlights were covered, major infrastructure was sandbagged, and air raid shelters hastily constructed. Oh, there's the cadets in the slit trenches. Brisbane gave American forces a rapturous welcome. Families invited them home for dinner, children got a taste for chewy. Everyone was dazzled by the sleek uniforms and polite manners. One local recalls that the GIs were like gods to the awestruck youngsters. And Maureen Meadows, who was as a young woman, remembers there were so many things about them to love. I loved their looks and their ways and the casual manner in which they gave you so generously of their cigarette ration. But most of all, I loved the way they said ma'am, and whether it was because of the way they looked at you while they did, you felt as if you were the one and only woman in their life who really mattered. For the moment, anyhow. Americans had been issued with a guidebook to Australia explaining everything from the Australian appetite for mutton and cups of tea, their love of sport. Unlike cricket, the book says, which is a polite game, Australian rules football creates a desire on the part of the crowd to tear someone apart, usually the referee. And there was a reference list for local slang. Sheila, we're told, is the Australian for babe. But there was ample room for confusion. In fact, the first American casualty in Brisbane died because he drove his army truck down the wrong side of the road. But soon everyone learned to love ice cream. Jazz came to the Trocadero, swing bands played at dance halls, celebrities visited. John Wayne, Artie Shaw, Eleanor Roosevelt, Eugene Ormandy for the more sophisticated, and what had once been a sleepy country town was transformed into an exciting cosmopolitan place. For a few short years, Brisbane rocked. Much later, Betty Churcher recalled that Brisbane in the 1950s, after the excitement of the war years, seemed like a rock pool after the tide had gone out. The young took to these changes with enthusiasm. A new world seemed just around the corner. American writers, artists and musicians energised the local scene. Local musicians discovered new musical forms. Aboriginal guitarist Johnny Nicole first heard jazz when Negro troops visited his home and played the piano. Pianist Billy Blackmore played with Artie Shaw, who tried to persuade her to visit America. The Aboriginal singer Dulcie Pitt, later Georgia Lee, toured Queensland performing for American troops. A group of students at Brisbane State High began a journal, Barjai, as an outlet for experimental art and literature, and no one over 21 was allowed to contribute. Thea Astley was one of those who did, as was Barry Reid and others. Judith Wright moved to Brisbane in 1943 to work at the University of Queensland and to help Clem Christensen with his new journal, Meanjin. Artists like Bill Bustard were recruited to work in the Camouflage Corps. The artist and writer Donald Friend worked for a time at Central Bureau, the code-breaking establishment in Hamilton, staffed by an odd collection of artists, poets, musicians and writers. Writing to a friend in Sydney, he describes life: "Brisbane, my love, is indeed very rococo and full of yanks and things." Sex was everywhere. American authorities dispensed prophylactics. Couples were arrested having sex in broad daylight in the botanical gardens, and children amused themselves collecting used condoms along the foreshore at Sandgate. The authorities turned a blind eye to the 20-odd brothels that operated around town, and a female doctor gave the girls regular medical checkups. Those women with venereal disease were confined in the Lock Hospital. Not everyone appreciated this new world. Good time girls drew the ire of community leaders as divorce rates rose from 100 in 1942 to around 400 the following year. The black market flourished, gambling dens and sly grog establishments proliferated, and newspapers expressed outrage at declining moral standards. Most Brisbaneites are familiar with the expression that Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. As always, it can be convenient to blame foreigners for any disruption in life. Housing shortages, price rises, even horror of horrors, beer shortages. But we're less familiar with General MacArthur's reputed observation that Brisbane was one of the most corrupt places in the South Pacific. Lots of locals saw the American invasion as an opportunity. It does, as they say, take two to tango. During the war, Queensland Police had to deal with a whole new set of circumstances. A protected occupation, so forbidden to enlist, police officers took on extra responsibilities: the internment of aliens, coastal surveillance, issues around air raids, training of air wardens, interviewing, photographing and fingerprinting all crew members on ships arriving in port, protection of railway lines, and so forth. At CIB, this is an old photo, but it's hard to get a photo of the lovely little building that was the CIB. Specialist squads investigated everything from homicides to consorting, from breaking and entering to illegal abortions. But now 2 new squads were needed to deal with pilfering from the railroads and the wharves. The 1943 Police Annual Report notes that 20% of all offences were committed by people under 21, and that there was a 16.6% increase in sex offences. War was good for crime. Wherever military forces occupy foreign countries, such as the Americans today in Okinawa or various military forces in Afghanistan or Iraq, high-level agreements must be reached to deal with the criminal behaviour by these forces, and Australia in World War II was no different. The May 1942 National Security Regulations amounted to full extraterritorial jurisdiction. For police, this meant that where any member of the United States Forces in Australia is arrested or detained on a charge of having committed an offence, the appropriate officer of the US Forces shall be notified, and if he so requests, the members shall be handed over to him and shall therefore cease to be subject to the jurisdiction of the criminal courts in Australia. Queensland Police, therefore, were responsible for investigating crimes committed by foreign soldiers, but once charged, those soldiers became the responsibility of their own country's military courts. The same crime might therefore be dealt with in very different ways and attract different sentences. For example, the Brisbane Truth, known for its, excellent and honourable reporting accurately, highlighted a case involving carnal knowledge of a girl under 12. In this instance, the sentence of the American military court was said to be much harsher than could have been expected in a local court, where the offence might have been deemed a misdemeanour. This is somewhat an exaggeration, but served the truth's purpose, which was to condemn light sentences for similar offences in Queensland. American military courts also tended to deal harshly where cases involved Negro troops, Although they constituted only 10% of the US forces, black soldiers account for nearly 2/3 of all courts martial. And cases involving homosexual activity account for 1/4 of all sex offence cases. But dealing with criminal cases didn't rate high in the US command. There was, after all, a war to be fought. A 1943 memo admonished officers to employ court-martials only as a last resort, to use the lowest type of punishment available and only when absolutely necessary. There's evidence that military officials often spirited suspects or offenders out of the country to unnamed battlefields, rather than face pressure for a court-martial from Australian authorities. The American military policeman accused of unlawful killing during the Battle of Brisbane, for example, was not even present when he was found not guilty, having already been transferred to Syria. Knowing they would probably be protected even if they committed crimes, surely emboldened some soldiers. It's hard to know the effect that this had on local police, but it must at the very least have been frustrating. Criminal activity during the war years increased significantly. Not all perpetrators, of course, were foreign, but many were. Without any possibility of obtaining a conviction in a local court, police may well have become cynical about the very crimes they were investigating, and I wonder about the extent to which the war and the crimes associated with that period, the growth in the black market, widespread gambling and sly grogging, the unofficial acceptance of prostitution, above all, the money to be made from all of these activities. I wonder how much all of this contributed to an environment where police corruption developed. And money there was in abundance. American soldiers earned twice what their Australian counterparts did. The US Army's Criminal Investigation Command in Brisbane was based in the Provost Marshal's office in the South Brisbane Town Hall, next to base headquarters at Somerville House. Here, crimes committed by American soldiers were investigated. Courts-martial were conducted in the municipal chambers of the Town Hall, and cells at the back of the building housed prisoners. Recently, criminal investigation files kept by US Technical Sergeant Irvin Task have been donated to the State Library, and together with police files at State Archives, provide an insight into life and death in this corrupt garrison town. And Matt Condon wrote an article in Q Weekend about some of those files. Amongst the cases that Task investigated, one in particular caught my eye: the murder of an American soldier whose body was found near the South Brisbane Cemetery. The details scarcely matter. His death was fuelled by booze and sex, although it provided salacious copy for papers around the state. But what most interested me was the name of the Queensland detective investigating: Frank Bischoff. Bischoff, Police Commissioner from 1958, Father of the Year, yet childless, notoriously corrupt but never convicted, the man who, according to Matt Condon, wrote the terms of reference for the 1963 Royal Commission into allegations made against members of the police force in relation to the National Hotel. In 1942, Frank Bischoff was in charge of CIB Squad 4, responsible for investigating abortions, sex offences, arson, assaults, homicides and unlawful killing. Bischoff famously boasted he got 32 convictions out of 33 murder charges, and I believe that the one that got away was this murder committed during World War II. I'm not working on a history book. I'm neither a military nor a legal historian. There are, in any case, too many things about this period that I can't prove. I don't want to wade through all the files at State Archives dealing with the sad and sordid crimes committed by soldiers during World War II, and I don't have the stomach for writing a biography of Frank Bischoff. In any case, his file at State Archives won't be released until 2054, by which time I'll be 101. Someday, someone will write a learned book about Bischoff and his role in Queensland's history, but it won't be me. But this period has long held a fascination for me. My aunt worked for Naval Signals, and she was always very conscious of having signed the Official Secret Act and was wary about giving details of her job. But she was also a painter, and I loved her stories of artists working in the camouflage corps and of restrictions about where you could set up your easel outdoors, no rail yards, no wharves. I was interested in how her worlds, the military and the artistic, collided. When anyone mentions Edinburgh or Berlin, Venice or Glebe, I don't think of buildings or tourist attractions. I think of Inspector Rebus, Detective Bernie Gunther, Commissario Brunetti, Cliff Hardy, Private Investigator. Crime fiction, I thought, might offer a way to tell some of these wartime stories, not just in an accurate way, but in an authentic way, a way that would recreate the sound and feel of the period as well as the details of events. Crime fiction would allow me to look at how various aspects of wartime life, the military, the social, the criminal, collided, and crime fiction allows me to play with a combination of fictional and historical characters. It brings colour to a black and white world. The holdings of the State Library are an amazing resource for historians, but I sometimes wonder if fiction writers fully appreciate their potential. Photos, you've seen some of them, letters you've heard about, newspapers, brochures, ephemera. All of these allow a writer to enter a period and listen to the voices of people from that time. People who speak not in hindsight, but as people who don't know what the next day will bring, let alone the next year. So I've used the State Library resources, along with those in state archives, the Police Museum and elsewhere, to write one and plan a second in a series of crime novels set in wartime Brisbane. And I have used the generosity of the Q ANZAC Fellowship to work with the Queensland Writers' Centre through their workshop and mentoring program to finalise and develop this work. What, I wondered, would an American military policeman make of Brisbane? What would he think of the officers and their Melbourne girlfriends drinking cocktails every night at Lennon's, of the brothel madams in West End, the sly grog shops in New Farm? How might he react to the different and overlapping layers of Brisbane society and to his own military organisation? Above all, what would he make of Frank Bischoff? And so Joey Washington has emerged, a man trying to navigate a foreign culture and almost a foreign language, a man who finds himself becoming a detective against the odds, a soldier fighting his own small war against evil and corruption. I hope I can bring him to life for you all, and if I do, it will be thanks in large part to the State Library of Queensland and to this fellowship. Thank you.
Now we'll get the fellows up here to sit in their seats, and we'll get some questions going. Thanks very much, Judith. That's fascinating. Wow. And congratulations on considering a fiction as a use for the archives, because that's what I did with my fellowship. And a lot of the research I've been doing here is working towards fiction, because as you say, you can actually explore things that you can't with non-fiction, and it opens up a world that you really can't recover. So we'll get the microphones, which I failed to do to start, a bit closer to us here. I might just ask you as well, Judith, I noticed that the figures that you put up for the crimes when the Americans were here in the 1940s, murders and gambling seemed to be going up, but everything else seemed to be the same. What was going on there? Was that a factor of the Americans prosecuting their own people?
I think some of it is that the stats don't come up because the Americans are dealing with their own crimes.
Do you have access to those?
So they don't even get to a court.
Do you have access to the American figures?
I haven't
It'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
gone into all the American figures.
No.
See, I'm avoiding statistics.
You want to have fun with
Yeah, I'm
with
just
fiction
gonna
and
play
good point. So the American court records would exist, though, wouldn't they, somewhere? And
The court-martial records do exist,
Yeah.
and people like Yorick Small, who's done a lot of work, particularly on the sex crimes issue, has been through them all, and someone else has who did a book on the American occupation. People have gone through it, but it's a big job, and a lot of stuff, like the sex crimes files, weren't released until 2011 at State Archives. So
yeah, a good fodder for fiction as well. All that information.
Oh,
isn't it?
yeah,
Ooh,
yeah.
wow. And I was, you answered a lot of my questions as as I was thinking of them. I was writing them down and crossing them out because you answered them. But I thought this sounds like a really good television series. And of course, haven't you thought of pitching that? Because it,
I actually have there's a nice guy in our book club who's a filmmaker, and actually said Brisbane's hopeless because it's all so wrecked, for filming historical stuff. There are, you can walk around Brisbane. The PX, where the Battle of Brisbane, that's still there. Lots of stuff's still around. But to actually film would be difficult.
Not like
now,
England, where you're going to have
think.
those country
Yeah.
roads still, and the little
Anyway,
villages.
good idea. Anyone who wants to.
Lisa, Stradbroke Island, was that used during and after World War II as it was for World War I, as a place for isolating, I suppose, socially embarrassing people in conditions like alcoholism? I'm thinking, I guess, of the soldiers from World War II who might have had similar problems.
No, after World War II, when the Air Force moved out of Sandgate, the state government, I think, saw that land opportunistically and quickly, almost overnight, moved the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum from the island to Sandgate and set up Eventide. So that happened very, very quickly. And then all the buildings on Dunwich were dismantled and sent off to different places around Queensland. Like the Victoria Hall went to Cherbourg, as government buildings.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know what happened to the World War I diggers after, who were in a similar situation.
Yeah. And Greer, I guess, alcohol's, we've been talking about that a bit, the last couple of speakers, but alcohol's one expression of trauma, perhaps, and, the World War I soldiers would have expressed, I suppose, some of their darker thoughts in their letters, but also would have expressed their feelings with the problems that they faced and maybe the things they brought back. What's sort of come out of the material that you've been looking at that suggests some psychological problems?
What I noticed was, before starting the fellowship, I sort of thought that the letters would be a lot more grim than they were. Like I was saying about Maurice, the prisoner of war, it honestly sounded like it was quite nice in the prison. Like he had quite a lovely life. But I did notice some patterns where, and of course there were things like they had to be careful about what they wrote because they wouldn't be able to send some things, and I think they were conscious of how their families were feeling. So they were quite edited, so you kind of had to go through, read between the lines essentially. But for example, Maurice would write quite a substantial paragraph about how everything, that long paragraph about all the beautiful flowers everywhere, and then the last two sentences would be, we've been quite anxious all week, one of ours is in the hospital. And then there'd be another really long paragraph about, we made plum pudding, thank you for the socks, the cake was amazing, 2 of my friends died last week. So there would just be these tiny, and I don't know whether that was a coping mechanism, where the hurt is kind of bursting out a little bit every now and then, or they just didn't want to talk about it and couldn't talk about it. So It sort of depends, but yeah. And then Herbert, he seemed very pragmatic right the way through his 2 diaries until he went to London, and I feel like that broke his spirit, coming out of the world and then having to go back in. And then he commented maybe 4 or 5 times, I don't want to be here, I don't want to be here, I don't want to be here. and then he passed away. But it sounded like a very traumatic, a particularly traumatic 2 weeks. His friends were dying. It was incredibly dangerous. They had gas masks on. The day before he died, he had a gas mask on for 5 hours in a row. And so then he was starting to talk about, you could see the psychological problems coming out in the diary, but before that, you couldn't see it.
I get the impression that everybody involved in the war, especially the soldiers who experienced the war, were traumatised in some way, and so that they've been skirting around the issue in their letters, but perhaps it's expressed when they get back in other issues like alcohol.
Yeah, I would say so.
Does anybody have any questions? So what I might do is get you to think about questions. If you do have a question, just raise your hand and Chrissy will bring a microphone. There's a question just here.
I understand what each of you are going to make of your projects, but Lisa, could you tell us what's going to be the result of your one?
That's a very good question. I still haven't really worked out what it's going to be, because what I've been doing is spending so much time with individual soldiers' stories. I have so much material that I'm trying to think up a way that you can convey the disparate stories without generalising. That's what I've struggled with, even just today in that talk, when you try to distill so much experience down, just to be able to, to talk about it. I'm struggling to know what to do with it.
There must be some
ideas?
Yeah, well, there must be some. I mean, epidemiologically, I guess the data you're collecting would be important in the study of trauma and alcoholism and how that's. I mean, is there enough data? Do you think that you mentioned that a lot of the history or the wounds or the injuries of the soldiers wasn't really recorded? Was it?
Oh no, there's amazing medical history in the
Oh, there
recap
is.
files. Incredible.
Okay.
Incredibly
So if you
detailed
cross-referenced all of that and then
Yeah.
compared the soldiers' experience, perhaps, and their
Yeah. So what I have is an amazing spreadsheet of
right.
because I've been focusing on the inebriates for this project, but I've also just been looking at all of the World War I soldiers who turned up in Dunwich, and that's over 500. So I have the most enormous spreadsheet of all kinds of information about them that I extrapolate in certain ways, and.
Well, there'd be a social science degree or something
yes.
in exploring a thesis of some sort.
It is a big story, yeah.
Any other questions?
I wish I had
Yes.
some plans.
Oh,
Thank you.
sorry, I'll hang up here. I didn't see you there. Come on.
A question for Lisa. Some years ago, not that far ago, there was a move by the Health Minister to shut down public access to all the Dunwich admission files to Dunwich Asylum and also homicide files. I find an interesting crossover here that there was supposed to be a 100-year ban that Queenslanders weren't grown up enough to even be allowed to go and look at those again. How did you manage the magic to get into soldiers' file and drunks and Dunwich all at once? Has the ban never applied, or
No.
is this fellowship that powerful?
The magic. Because those records of the soldiers are now deemed to be Queensland health records, they have 100-year privacy legislation applied to them. So, yes, technically they are closed from 100 years. That's only their admission records. So the information, the other health data is in their repatriation files, so the ones that came back and actually did manage to stick with the repatriation for a while. A lot of the inebriates just weren't able to, lost their pensions and they disappear. The ones that were able to hang it together a bit and keep a pension do have really substantial repatriation files, and they're all open at the National Archives. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk about a man who has helped me a bit with identifying these people, and he has been working with State Archives for years, so he has some material from before the ban, and that's been useful in helping to identify certain individuals. Yeah, but it is a challenge for researchers when their health records.
Judy, speaking of records, that's how you came across this story, isn't it? You were handed a large number of
the
records.
files that I talk about, the murder file and so forth, by the Urban Task, through a long, complicated series of things, actually came to me via my cousin and my sister, and it's a long, complicated story. And fortunately, State Library now has them. Nobody wanted to take them because they're actually technically government files, or copies of government files. But Irvin Task came back. He lived in Australia. He lived here for the rest of his life, and he gave them to my cousin, who was doing a film about Brisbane during the war. And but State Libraries consulted with the relevant American authorities, and they're happy for them to be here, because really no one in America would be particularly interested in them, and they really should be here. So and they just, the files that he kept documenting all the various crimes he was investigating.
They fell into the right hands, didn't they, in the end?
Eventually.
Con.
Well, first of all, I look forward to reading about Joey Washington, and I hope it's not too long, My question basically is, in some of the material that I've read, there was the idea that MacArthur was not really of a very high opinion of Australians generally. That's number one. Number two, quite often he downplayed the achievements of Australian military, and in fact, in some cases, in his reports, he, how should I say, I won't say purloined, but basically slanted the success of Australian forces to that of the US. Have you come across anything like that, or is that a propaganda thing?
No, well, that's essentially what I've understand too. All reports coming from the battlefield in Papua New Guinea had to go through his office, basically. Nothing. So Australian forces couldn't make their own press releases. They had to wait for MacArthur to okay them. MacArthur and Blamey didn't get on, and MacArthur and Curtin did, but MacArthur and Blamey didn't. And that's generally what I understand. But again, I'm no military historian, and I'm sure there are many more people who know more about it than I would. But that's my understanding.
Greer, when you were talking there, you were mentioning that each, diary, page of a diary and letter, they're pieces of artwork in themselves, aren't they? There's a very, just looking at them can stir the emotion. So, sort of a visceral reaction to, especially an object that's handwritten. Yeah. How are you going to use that for your project?
Well, to be honest, when I started the fellowship, I freaked out for a moment because they're all so beautiful that I sort of felt like the work was done. I didn't actually need to do anything when I looked at it. But I'm quite interested in my last two shows, I've started to incorporate text more and more into the work, handwriting. One of my works in my show last year was based on the last conversation I had with my mother before she passed away, and and it was something that she had written in a letter as well. So I love the raw, the visceral, all of those qualities about the handwritten objects, and then also just with the way I linked it. I love Cy Twombly. I don't know if any of you know the American painter, but so much of the diary, they're so beautiful. I mean, it's a strange thing to say about all the marks and, just finding out where someone has paused. Or another interesting thing I noticed was, obviously because they didn't have much paper, they would try to fill every part of it up, and it was quite interesting what they would choose to write at the end. For example, Michael Levine, who arrived in Gallipoli, is very short. It's just 4 pages. But he writes almost the most dramatic things. He fits down the side. He'll write all this is sort of what's happening, and then he wrote down the side if something doesn't change, someone's going to get hurt soon. So they're very dramatic, powerful statements.
Yes.
So I'd like to incorporate parts of those into the layers.
So when you say tics, you mean
Wait,
little idiosyncrasies that the writer brings to the letter.
yeah, so I sort of became interested in graphology as part of this, which I hadn't really thought about before, but sort of analysing the handwriting as part of it to try and pull out more about what was perhaps going on in their subconscious, I guess, yeah.
So that's how you choose, I suppose, who you're going to use. When you mentioned as well, one of the writers was writing more clearly some of the more powerful images. He would mention bodies, and that was obviously a more clearly written, so he was emphasising that word.
Well, that's what it looked like to me, but it seemed like it looked like an unconscious decision that he had just scribbled it. But when, if you just squint at the drawing, at the writing, those were the three words that you could see most clearly. And as an artist, sometimes when you're looking at an image, you squint at it first to try and see where the dark and light is as a way of starting your drawing.
As you might with an artwork.
Yeah, the same way. And so when I was squinting at that particular work, I just thought, oh wow, he's talking about the trees, but really what's hit him is the bodies and the So
What a fascinating approach. Any other questions? Lisa, yes.
Yeah, Lisa, I can speak on this.
Well, we'll get a microphone to you anyway.
Thank you. It's nice to see 3 women today, the International Women's Day.
Yes.
I wonder about being called fellows. I wanted to ask Lisa, I know you poured through so many sad stories and I don't know how you did it, but were there any happy ones?
Oh. No. I can't think of a single happy one. No, I think because these blokes that I've been dealing with are blokes from the margins. I can't ever remember closing up a file and thinking, "Whew, that worked out well." No, they're all pretty awful. Yeah.
Did any recover? With their treatment, did it help any recover?
Oh, from some of those, some of the alcoholics weren't, I don't think, truly alcoholics for very long. They were just people who needed some time to sort themselves out, and maybe they got married. You kind of lose them. The ones you can track have got repatriation files, and so they're constantly writing to the government for years after the war, sometimes, up to the 50s. So some do get better. Some are only alcoholics for a very short time, and they die in their 80s. In fact, what hit me about these fellas is that not many of them die young. A lot of them have long and miserable lives, really, instead of short ones. Yeah.
But I'm assuming a lot self-medicating. They were self-medicating because of the trauma rather than being susceptible, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think also because of their lack of, because they're really on their own, that their sadness is not hidden in the families.
That's right. So sort of a lack of control that they feel with not having a job, not having a family. That's a part of the cycles of abuse.
And for some of them, it doesn't come out for many, many years. There was one family I spoke to, actually the descendants of a World War I soldier whose trauma really didn't materialise until the late 1930s. And then he was a World War I soldier, and he came home and got married and had a family and kept it together for a while, but he ended up in Goodna. There's a lot of traffic between Dunwich and Goodna. He ended up in Goodna at the end of the 1930s, and then eventually dies in Dunwich and is buried in the Dunwich cemetery. And he did have a family and a life, but his trauma does go back to the First World War.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. On that subject of alcoholism and the support, I was wondering whether you came across what sort of help did the various church groups, for instance, Salvation Army, but specifically thinking of the Anglican Church and
Con, if you just put the microphone to your mouth so we can record it.
Well, I thought my voice was loud enough, but there we go. Specifically, the Canon Garland's activity, how did that come across into your area? I'm thinking in terms of, Garland set up these clubs for servicemen during the war, which existed even after, and one still exists at Rainbow Bay even to this day. But how did that help, if it helped in any way in that problem that you talk about?
Look, I can't specifically think of any, in my research I haven't come across church-run organisations. I spent a lot of time researching the Red Cross records because they seem to have this really interesting network of places all around the country areas as well as in Brisbane, and did a lot of fundraising, and they've obviously kept very good records which are here at the State Library. And the Salvation Army has operated similar, and the YMCA, but I haven't come across church ones. That's maybe something else to think about.
Hi, can you hear me? Yep,
Yes.
That's good. Sweet. This one's for Greer. Greer, I found your work really thought-provoking because I've been doing a lot of just studying into Jungian work and the archetypes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be doing a lot of cross-referencing here, I guess. So the hero's journey starts off with a call to adventure, essentially, and so the hero begins within order and then ventures into chaos and has to slay the dragon. So think of something like The Hobbit and Bilbo Baggins. And when I was looking at the imagery that you brought up, the diary in itself is a symbolic imagery, because if you think of The Hobbit, Bilbo, he writes the story himself, and so that's his text, that's his journal. But Bilbo gets to go home, and he doesn't get called back into the chaos. Whereas Herbert does, and so maybe there's something there for you to explore. Have you thought about exploring that, what happens when the hero is forced back into chaos against his?
I did think
will.
about that a little bit with the hero's journey, and I think how they would have. You're sort of playing out the fairy tales in your adult life, basically, and I'm sure on some level all of the soldiers would have been thinking that, and with all the propaganda at home about the hero going away and all those kinds of things. But so in that sense, if they don't have a story or an archetype to follow through, as you say, then you do get lost, and there's no answer and there's no pattern to follow. So that is probably, like you say, with Herbert going back, the story didn't make sense to him perhaps anymore. So,
I guess we seek a narrative, don't we, in our lives, and they would have sought narratives in their own lives to try to make sense of what had happened to them. And it's interesting you mentioned Tolkien there, who I think with The Lord of the Rings was referencing World War I experiences with the marshes and the bodies. I don't know whether Tolkien admitted that, but that's seems to be part of that. So that sense of storytelling through imagery as well, I guess, is one way of helping these guys express what they were trying to describe many years later, from dissecting their letters in that sort of way, looking for imagery.
There was just one little tidbit that I also found interesting was Bilbo, he has to develop his shadow and become a thief, someone bad in order to be, to complete a good thing. And your images of the soldiers taking the trophies, the statues and the scarabs and stuff. So the soldiers going on their journey and becoming thieves themselves. So nice little parallel there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
The war itself is a human, as part of the human experience. We're drawn to those stories. And Judy, that time in World War II, 1942, 1943, it was a period of extreme emotion and social upheaval, and in some ways a time where a lot of people were perhaps more alive because of the imminent threat. Is that what appeals to you as in trying to fictionalise that time? Do you think?
Yes, probably. Yeah.
But all these young men, you know, at the prime of their life.
A lot of people, it's easy to. For a lot of people, the war was the best time of their life. For a lot of people, it was the excitement, you know, a foreign country, you know. Not everybody, World War One was far worse in many ways, but not everybody was in danger. There were many people who were, but not everyone.
And the people, the young men who were in danger probably weren't quite aware of the danger they were in, and especially when they came to Brisbane first before stepping off.
No one at 22 is aware of anything.
That's right.
I mean, you know, heavens.
That's right.
You know.
So they were sort of let off the hook. I know they were trained, militarily trained, but they were young guys on a bit of an adventure overseas.
A lot of them weren't very well trained at all.
No. So in some ways it's surprising there wasn't more trouble in Brisbane, perhaps. And how many young men passed through? 1 million?
Lots.
Gee.
Yeah.
And to see the crime statistics, you know, there's a few aberrations there, but not that much. Fascinating story to tell in a fiction, I think.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So
Yes.
where were the hot spots?
Sorry.
Well, Brisbane's a tiny city. It was a city of about 300,000, okay? So it doubled during the war. But, you know, think of it, you can Google and find where the tram lines went, but that was the extent of the city. And it was really small. You could walk everywhere, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah, question for all of the panel individually, but starting with you, Lisa, if I may. You mentioned that the lion's share of what you could produce out of your study over a year pretty much hinged on the NAA's wonderful files, I assume. State Archives sort of second rank. Where does the State Library in the fellowship stand as an anchor for the amount of work that you were able to achieve by being here as opposed to those other two places, which would have taken whole days at a time? I imagine if you're doing 500 individual biographies effectively. So for you, how much did this place really work best to do a fellowship, or could you have done it without being here and just doing it independently?
So the State Library collections, for my particular topic, what it provided is the broader context, because you look at the repatriation files and you're getting the sense of this person. But the State Library records, I spent a lot of time looking at the broader stuff that was happening in Queensland in the period. So it's the context. There's amazing photographic collection. It's also just, in terms of the fellowship, it's the most extraordinary opportunity because of the space, the time it gives you, the staff at the library. It's the chance to bring, in my particular case, it's the chance to bring these archives all together, where you couldn't do this whole story in one archive. And the State Library collections, you just never know what you're going to find. You stick a word into that one search, and God knows what you're going to find.
There's always personal stories popping up here. You can, you could browse the archives here and come up with some fabulous book ideas, research ideas, just in a few hours. It is surprising what pops up. There's so much information. And
just one example, I had those photos of those soldiers that were on the bikes. That was in a collection of Mrs. Cumbray Stewart, and that particular box had her sketches, personal sketches, a whole lot of invitations and some correspondence, and those photos just fell out. And I was so excited about those photos because I'd love to be able to identify the men and work out who they are. But, they were there kind of accidentally. And they're kind of the best, the most exciting things I found.
Serendipity plays a big role, doesn't it, in
Absolutely.
research, and,
Yeah.
and that's where the State Library also comes in, because you can be looking for something and find something else that you weren't looking for but is even more important, and that's what happens quite a lot, I've noticed. And a question up the back here.
Lisa and Greer, this is probably as much a comment as a question about World War One, which unfortunately in this country has an overlay of myth that I find quite disturbing. I don't know whether either of you are aware of the book Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves about World War One, his account. And secondly, the poem by Wilfred Owen called Dulce et Decorum Est. Sorry, Dulce et Decorum Est. My Latin's not all that good. Both of them, which I think represent what World War One was all about, a total tragedy. Human psychological tragedy.
Oh yeah, it was horrific. It's absolutely horrific. And in terms of the truth about the war, you're getting first-hand accounts in the diaries. So if there's anywhere that you want to learn about what happens, you go straight to the horse's mouth. You know, like it's the most interesting way to learn about it. I didn't know very much about the war previous to the fellowship, so it is an incredible way to learn about it. And I can't really talk about Herbert's story enough, because over the 2 diaries, I just learned so much about the war, just the day-to-day, what it was like, what they were wearing, what they were carrying, the boredom, the fear, the confusion, the waiting, the hurry up and wait, you know, like all of the strange things that went on. It's a really interesting way to learn about social history, I think. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. Just up. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Can't see. Oh, okay, sorry. Yes. Yes, no, you've been waiting for a long time, and I've been pointing in other directions. Sorry about that.
This is a question for Greer. I just wondered what drew you to apply for a scholarship, for a fellowship here. What were you exploring, the war or Anzacs, or what brought you to this fellowship?
It came about in quite an organic way, actually, because the show I had at Noosa Regional Gallery the year before was about archetypal imagery, basically, with the hearts and symbolism on what a single image means to us. And in November of that year, my grandmother, who's now 99, she's in New Zealand. You may have picked up that I'm a Kiwi at this point. She became ill, and I flew back immediately to see her. And we thought that she was going to pass away, and I'm the sentimentalist in the family, and I was going through all of... my grandfather was in the Second World War, and I've always been really intrigued by all the tiny little photographs and everything that she has. And my grandmother keeps all of those, everything, the photographs, the letters that she has, in a woven basket under her bed from my grandfather. And so I was collecting up those images, and I had a necklace that Granddad brought back from the Second World War with, you know, a little Egyptian motif on it, and the woven basket, which was also from Egypt. And so that kind of, all of that emotion and all of those ideas, I ended up creating the body of work from that, and that's when I was looking at the Book of Symbols and I was thinking about the war, and then I kind of approached it in the same way, like in reverse, like look at the ideas first and research it afterwards. And I discovered that basket has a lot of interesting meaning, like womb and nourishment and bounty. And I just wondered if that was why my grandmother was subconsciously keeping all of those precious things in the basket. And so all of those ideas and the war and everything. And then I actually saw, I didn't know there were fellowships here, and I had seen something advertised for the library in Melbourne. And I was like, oh, that would be amazing. I would love to do that research and create a body of work. And then I saw it here, and I was like, that's amazing, because it's exactly, after just completing that body of work and just touching on those topics, it's exactly what I wanted to do. So it's very fortuitous that I came across it. Yeah.
It sounds like everybody, all these fellows really have been fortunate, I guess, in finding a project that slips quite easily, quite well into the library's collections and has enabled them to pursue something that might not have otherwise been able to be pursued, and their fascinating insights, all of them into the history of war that we would not have normally thought about, and certainly I wouldn't have considered. So that's the value, really, isn't it, of the research that's being done here. Are there any last questions? We've got a few minutes to go. Yes.
In my research into aircrew from Bomber Command, a couple of the things that have been said by different speakers really ties it in together, because their life on the bases, in the mission operations that are flying, it was total excitement, and they lived to the day all the time. And back at base, when they weren't flying, they drank. And when they came back, well, out of the aircrew I've been looking at, 4 came back. 3 out of those became alcoholics and ruined their married life, their whole life. One particular person I've been researching for his son, he never really knew his father, because his father left, just walked out on them, and it was purely he couldn't cope with the boredom of everyday life after the war. They just so keyed up the whole time, just normal everyday life was boring, and just went to alcohol.
That's right. So it's a constant theme. Look, we might. Sorry, Gavin. Yes.
I was just going to be a smart aleck, but I just remember there was a quote from Keith Miller about pressure, and I forget the exact word of the quote, but it's like, pressure's not bowling at Lords, it's like when you've got a Messerschmitt following you from behind, and it was like putting it in context of, day-to-day life versus life and death.
That's right. I'd met a man, an American soldier who was in the Pacific. His name was Walter J. Thalen. He was a real estate agent in New York, but I met him just bumped into him a couple of times at the airport. He had a very big man and a really loud voice, and he was, he came to Brisbane and Melbourne, but he was in the Solomons, and he was part of a platoon that was tasked with chasing Japanese planes. I think they had on the machine guns, 50 calibre machine guns on the back of a boat. I'm not quite sure how that worked. This is what he described anyway. But Walter and a friend of his brewed wood alcohol for their platoon and killed, I can't remember how many, 10 or 12 of them. And they were going to court-martial and shoot Walter for doing this. But Walter was, I don't know, he was valued, I think, by his commanding officer. He had 2 Thompson submachine guns, and his commanding officer told him to get rid of one of them. Anyway, he was put in the clink, basically, for the rest of the war. So he arrived in Brisbane and was confined, basically, to the boat. But he snuck off and did a bit of a tour of Queensland. But he after the war, so he got one. His commanding officer told him to get rid of one of his Thompson submachine guns, and he buried it 6 paces west of a palm tree on Rendover Island. And every year since the war, he'd been going back to Rendover trying to find this machine gun that he'd buried. But he was one of the people. He didn't drink much. He was a big man. He didn't seem to be affected by the war at all, or his terrible crime of killing most of his comrades. So we hear the terrible stories, and Walter's story is not really that charming, but he's one of the survivors, I guess. He had the personality that pulled him through, and he became a successful real estate agent, and in spite of his alcoholic experiences, never really succumbed to it himself. Now, look, we might wrap it up there. It's been a fascinating discussion. It's always interesting speaking to these fellows. I learn so much. So thanks very much to everybody for coming. And we probably have a few minutes afterwards if you want to ask some private questions, but please join me in thanking Greer Townshend, Lisa Jackson and Judith Powell.